and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversations around books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. The guest this month is Dr. Juli Fraga, and with a background working with individuals who are struggling with postpartum depression and anxiety, maternal and childhood trauma, we talk with Juli about her new book, Parents Have Feelings Too, which was co-written with Hilary Jacobs Hendel.
In Parents Have Feelings Too, Dr. Fraga and Hilary Jacobs Hendel explore the emotional realities of parenting, offering practical tools for understanding feelings, healing old wounds, and building a deeper connection with our children. We talk about concepts like emotional honesty, the change triangle, repair in relationships, and why parents don't need to be perfect in order to raise emotionally healthy kids.
For her second book pick, Juli chose The Witch's Daughter by Orenda Fink, a memoir that blends magical realism, music, family history, and emotional truth. We explore the book's portrayal of the mother-daughter relationship, intergenerational trauma, creativity as a path toward healing, and what readers can learn about emotional regulation from the complex family dynamics that are at the heart of this story.
It was a really fun conversation, and it was great to connect with another Bay Area therapist and hear her journey as a therapist and a writer, and dig into a book that is really giving parents permission to have their own feelings.
And we have some lovely background music in this episode as Juli's daughter was having a piano lesson at the same time. So keep an ear out for that, and I hope you enjoy that piece too.
So, hi, Juli. Welcome to Books from Your Therapist.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited to have you and talk about your book today. But before we jump in, we were hoping you could just give us a little bit of an intro about who you are for our listeners.
I am a psychologist here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been in practice for over 20 years. I primarily work with parents in my practice, new parents, expecting parents, and really parents with kids of all ages. My specialization in terms of therapy, I oftentimes work with a lot of parents who experience some form of emotional childhood trauma and are working to navigate and heal those wounds as they enter into parenthood. And I am also a writer, as you know, and a parent, and I have a daughter who is soon to be 18.
Wow. So this book really is just a combination of so many aspects of your life, it seems.
Absolutely. And so many aspects, I think, of my clinical passion and just combining a lot of my clinical work and personal interest.
So what inspired you to become a therapist?
I would say when I was 14, I was watching the Oprah Winfrey Show. And Oprah, I don't remember who she had on, but she was talking about healing your inner child. And I grew up in a home that was pretty high conflict, not a lot of emotional support, a lot of like feeling, kind of like walking on eggshells a lot. And so I remember thinking, like watching this snippet of Oprah, when I like leave home one day, I'm going to figure out how to heal my inner child. And I went off to college. I was always interested in psychology, but I was also always interested in why we do the things that we do. How do we become the people that we are? And so, I went off to college, took Psychology 101, and just really loved psychology from the get-go and kind of decided there, my freshman year of college back in, I don't know, 1993 or something, that I was going to pursue becoming a psychologist.
So really, you sort of found that passion quite young.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about the book that you've co-written with Hilary Jacobs Hendel. I'm really curious about how you met and how this writing partnership came about.
So I think it was 2016, I was reading the New York Times and I stumbled upon an op-ed called It's Not Always Depression. And it was Hilary's op-ed. It's a brilliant op-ed, but she's talking about a clinical example of a man who had what we might label treatment-resistant depression. But really underneath the symptom of depression was deep shame. And she really talks about her work as an AEDP therapist. And AEDP is a form of, I would say, trauma-focused, emotion-focused therapy. And it's a form of therapy that Hillary and I both practice. Hillary has been doing AEDP for well over 20 years. She's an AEDP supervisor and therapist. And so I read this op-ed and I just really loved it. At the time, I was doing a lot of freelance journalism where I oftentimes write mental health stories or wellness stories. So I just emailed Hillary and asked her if I could interview her or talk with her about her work. And so, kind of from that, evolved, I guess, this working relationship. And we both love writing. We're both therapists. And so, maybe a couple years later, I asked her if she wanted to collaborate on an article called How to Give Your Therapist Feedback. That Hillary and I wrote then for the New York Times. And then I love her book so much. We were talking, it was during the pandemic when we would sometimes hop on Zoom. And we were just talking about these tools. And I was like, have you ever thought of giving these tools to parents, handing them the tools, but having a parenting book? And just through that conversation is how the idea for our book, Parents Have Feelings Too, was born.
I love that your friendship came by like you just reaching out. We talked in the last episode about, like you slide into people's DMs or you like send messages to people you're admirable of. So it's really nice that it's actually been a fruitful friendship that you guys have developed over time.
Yeah, for over 10 years.
And you mentioned a little bit that you were writing as well. I'm just curious about like how your foray into writing came about. Was it primarily like academic or did it move into, you mentioned the op-ed. So I'm just curious about like what your history with writing was.
So I always loved writing, even going back to college. And back in college, I would take English classes, creative writing classes, and like fiction classes, fiction writing classes. And I really loved writing, and I was like, maybe I should become a writer. But I was like, somehow I don't know if that's the same path to financial stability as psychology. And so it wasn't really until maybe after I became a parent that I just started kind of writing like, blogs, for myself mostly, not for anyone else's eyes. And then in, gosh, maybe like 2015, I had written a personal essay about my experience of motherhood. And I was like, oh, I think I might send this somewhere and see if it could get published. And then at that time, there was a blog on the New York Times called Motherload that was all about parenting. And I was like, I'll just send it over there where I don't have anything to lose. And so my essay was published. And then as a psychologist, I was like, well, I liked writing that essay, but I don't know that I want to keep writing personal essays, just given the intersection of my personal life and my professional life. And so I just had the idea. I was like, maybe I'll just try to start writing reported stories. And so I just kind of started reading stories that I really liked in the newspaper, really paying attention to what makes for a good story idea, taking some writing classes. And from there, I kind of inched into freelance journalism. So I've done a lot of freelance journalism now for, gosh, over 10 years and written op-eds, but I also write reported stories across a range of subjects. Like I do a lot of mental health stories, but in more recent years, I've actually started writing a lot of finance stories as they relate to people's emotions and doing, longer journalistic projects, which has also been really fulfilling.
That's awesome. It's like you're moonlighting as a successful journalist.
I'm so curious about like the idea of content creation now, because I'm thinking back to maybe when you started writing. Our last guest we had on talked about like how, she had put out content first and then ended up writing a book, but it must be interesting for you to kind of witness the change in, an online therapist presence or writing specific content as opposed to like a long format. So I'm curious, like, how have you noticed like the environment change for a therapist that's also a writer?
I mean, definitely when I started writing, there was not nearly the amount of content that there is now. I mean,
Mhm.
I think now with social media and with a lot of just the kind of whole wellness kind of niche of people sharing a lot in kind of what in therapy circles we might kind of dub therapy speak, sharing an awful lot of content. It's much harder, I would say, to maybe grab someone's attention because so much online content is out there. And now, as we inch into AI, sadly, a lot of the publications, even that I used to write for, like Self Magazine, places have really either shut down or don't even accept, articles any longer. So it's a much more difficult landscape, which has been a bit sad and disappointing to see than it was when I started. I would say also kind of in the last 5 years, I've also inched into more content creation for some different wellness companies where I collaborate with them as a subject matter expert, which is really fun. And that's super enjoyable. And it's also so different than when, as a journalist, you're really like sinking your teeth in deep to like your own story, to something that you really believe in and, going out and interviewing those sources. But then as a freelancer, it's not like you still have to find your story a home. And so you can put a lot of work into it. And then, it's still kind of like, I don't know, a shot in the dark in a way. Kind of like writing a book proposal as well, I would say.
We are going to jump into your books, well, your book and the other book of your choosing, but I just have one more question about this because this is very, very interesting. Just like I'm curious about what can you bring from your like therapist hat? How does that lean into your journalist hat? Like, is there learnings from, seeing clients all over these years? How has that informed your writing or vice versa?
I would say it's more that maybe the therapy hat can help the journalist hat in the sense that I might have a sense of an idea of something that I think could be really meaningful to talk about that isn't being talked about enough. For example, also in my practice, I do a lot of work with women who are struggling with postpartum depression and anxiety. And, when I started delving into journalism, well, over 10 years ago, there wasn't as much attention on perinatal mood concerns as there is now. I saw that and was like, what could I talk about as it relates to postpartum depression? And I should also share that I have to also use my objective hat. Like as a journalist, I might have an idea of something I'm seeing, but I also will go then do a deep dive into research to see what are the latest studies, what of those studies is there like a crossover into what I'm thinking about, and then trying to kind of come up with a journalistic idea in that way. So it might start in my practice, but then I find some objective like research or information to back it up.
Nice. It's such an interesting dynamic that you have these
Yeah.
two careers. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself, either professionally or personally, before we jump into the books?
No, I don't think so. Yep.
All right. So, your book, Parents Have Feelings Too. First off, I have to say, I love the title. I think it's evocative. I can just imagine someone walking into a bookstore and seeing this title and just being like, whoa, right? Because of how much content and literature is out there around, really like diving in as a parent. And it's like, wait, I'm impacted too. So I just love the title. I thought it was just so perfect and curious sort of what inspired you to write this particular book.
I think what really inspired me to write it is there are so many books that teach parents how to deal with their kids' feelings, starting when they're toddlers. Use your words, tune into your child's feelings. There's a lot more information now in education, early education on social emotional learning. But what benefit are any of those tools if parents don't have the tools themselves? And I kind of felt like parents are being left out of a really meaningful conversation if we want to bring it full circle about like parents have emotions and what can they do about their emotions. A complete backbone of Hillary's work is really giving the public an education in emotions, which is something, none of us really necessarily receives in school. We might receive messages on our families, but that's not necessarily kind of in the biology of emotions, the purpose they serve, how we recognize when we're having them, how we navigate through them. And so that was kind of the genesis of writing this particular book that helps parents with their feelings.
I love this because it's reminding me of this sentiment that's like a dysregulated adult can never regulate a child. And I've worked a lot with parents, and there's like this, okay, yeah, I know that. And how do I do that? Or, right. So I think you're totally on point with the fact that there are so many books that really address how to have this emotional education for your child. But many of us did lack that in our own lives. So I just think it's such a great idea and so needed. Can you give us a brief overview of how the book is laid out?
So the book is talking about a lot of different emotions, but also kind of informing the reader about different categories of emotions. So, for example, there are what we call inhibitory emotions, guilt, shame, and anxiety. And we can think of these emotions as self-conscious emotions. If we do something, let's say I forget my partner's birthday, I'm going to feel guilty and I'll make an amend. So, a self-conscious emotion, when it's working in our favor, is an emotion that makes us think twice. It prompts us to fit in with society and with our families. But what happens oftentimes when our feelings haven't been validated and seen in childhood, or when there's emotional wounds, those emotions start to serve a different purpose. And we experience them maybe too much. And oftentimes, when we think we've done something wrong, we think we're bad, but we really aren't. And so the next category of emotions that we delve into in the book are what are called core emotions. We can think of them as biological signals, much like thirst and hunger, that we really need for our survival and to thrive and flourish. For example, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, excitement. But oftentimes, let's say in childhood, anger was always forbidden. Let's say if you ever became angry, your parents inadvertently shamed you, not because they meant to hurt you, but maybe that's what happened to them. Because a child is so dependent on their caregiver for survival and security, a child unknowingly will learn that anger isn't okay. And unknowingly, they will learn to compartmentalize, as we say in psychology, which kind of means to move away. We could think of that from that emotion. But what might happen instead is anytime a child experiences anger, instead they become anxious, where they feel shame. And so the book really talks about how to identify these emotions. And then we talk, which I'm sure we'll get into, the emotional health tool that Hillary has in her first book. It's called the Change Triangle. It was originally called the Triangle of Change, developed by a therapist named David Mallon, who originally came up with this tool to help therapists with their clients. But Hillary popularized it, called it the Change Triangle. And really, it helps people, and in this case, parents, identify what category of emotion they're experiencing and how to move from that category of emotion. We really want to be in core emotion and learn how to identify, name, validate the core emotion so that we can get to a place where we're feeling more calm, more compassionate, more connected with ourselves and with our children, and kind of where we can approach a problem and solving it with a stance of curiosity instead of one of reactivity.
As we're here, let's stay on the change triangle then, because we actually mentioned this in a previous episode as well when we went over Hillary's book. But can you describe to listeners what it actually is and what it means and how one might use it?
Sure. So the change triangle, you can think of it as an emotional compass. So if you just picture in your mind an upside down triangle, okay? So on the left corner of the triangle, we have what are called inhibitory emotions. And again, that's guilt, shame, and anxiety. And those emotions, help us follow, like I said, the rules of society. They help us fit in with our families. They help us make amends, but they become problematic when we experience them too much. On the other side of the triangle, you have what are called defenses. And defenses are anything we do to avoid a really painful emotion. So you could imagine if I have a lot of anxiety and that's pretty intolerable, I might use what we call a defense to cope with it. So what's a common defense that oftentimes we see people use with anxiety? Avoidance, right? Intellectualization.
Hmm.
And all of these things might work temporarily in the sense that it takes the edge off the anxiety, but it doesn't work in our favor because it doesn't help us to thrive and to be our best selves. So oftentimes what we see, especially people who have survived a lot of trauma, especially emotional trauma, is that they're existing at the top of the triangle, but they don't realize it. So they have a lot of inhibitory emotions, guilt, shame, and anxiety. And the way they're coping is to use a lot of defenses to try to deal with those emotions. I mean, other defenses might be self-criticism, blaming someone else, drinking too much, eating too much. Depression could even be a defense against an emotion like shame, an emotion like anxiety. I mean, defenses are endless, and there's a bunch of defenses in the book, but it's kind of building in the book that emotional awareness. So we have inhibitory emotions and defenses at the top of the triangle. As we move towards the middle of the triangle, we have what are called our core emotions. Core emotions, again, are those survival signals. They're emotions that help us survive and thrive. And we have sadness, anger, fear, disgust, joy, and excitement. When we're able to identify and name those emotions, we're in a much different place because we can take what we call an adaptive action, which is an action that really works in our favor or in our family's favor. And so that helps us all get to the bottom of the triangle, which we call the open-hearted state of the authentic self. So when we're in an open-hearted state, we feel calm, feel more connected, we're curious maybe instead of reactive, and we can have compassion for ourselves and also for our kids. That's really where we want to stay. None of us lives at the bottom of the triangle. That's not possible. But the whole goal of the change triangle is to give you a map on how to work with your emotions so that you can get to the bottom of the triangle and hopefully learn how to stay there longer and also help your child to impart those tools so that your kids have a map on how to work with their emotions too.
I appreciate you talking about all the core emotions. And I know we'll get back to the calm, connection, curiosity, compassion, because I think we should highlight that. But disgust really popped out to me as an interesting core emotion, particularly when it comes to parenting, because I imagine that there's like parts of parenting that do feel very disgusting, but as a parent, feeling like I should be embracing these parts or like pressure to not feel that core emotion. Can you talk more about the function of disgust?
So disgust is an emotion, right, that helps us survive in the sense that it really helps us identify when something's harmful to us, or maybe when we've been, I don't know, poisoned in some way. Like if we, I mean, you take some milk out of your refrigerator and it's completely rotten, it's an emotion that makes us kind of pull back. Like it's like, whoa, I shouldn't kind of like, I should get rid of this. And there's an awful lot of disgust and disgusting feelings, I would say, in parenthood, starting even with a baby. I mean, changing diapers, spit up, all of these different things, and just learning how to identify that emotion for what it is without any shame around it, both as a parent and to validate it for yourself that yes, this is disgusting and I still love my kid. And
Mhm.
also to impart the tools because we never know how the way we talk about disgust might land with a kid. For example, even saying too much, that's so gross when you do that. Why do you always have to do that? Ooh, you're smelly. You never know the temperament of your kid. You saying that too much could really instill a sense of shame, even when you're not meaning to. And so learning how to work with the emotion of disgust and respond to it in yourself, but also respond to it, which we talk about in the book, with your child so that they recognize disgust for what it is and they're not left with a sense of shame, for doing something, that we might kind of label as disgusting.
The other, just really briefly, wanted to mention disappointment and how I think many of us can relate to having a like feeling our parent is disappointed in us. And I like that the book really normalized disappointment to your point, like disgust, like these other, emotions and kind of putting the call to action on the parent to learn how to manage their own disappointment and self-soothe and figure that out. So it doesn't come out as shaming or resentment. I think disappointment is something that anyone that has had an active parent in their lives can relate to.
Absolutely. And I think that, of course, it's a normal human emotion. And yet, I think sometimes to tell a child repeatedly that you're disappointed in them, depending also what you're disappointed about, but some parents might have grown up in homes where they believe that expressing disappointment is a way to motivate somebody. And yes, maybe it does motivate a kid, but not for the right reason. They're motivated then out of maybe their own shame, maybe out of their anxiety, not because authentically they maybe want to do great in school. Let's say it's about a kid's grades. And so, really, to talk about disappointment without using the word disappointment, and also to recognize our own disappointments, because sometimes we're disappointed because we have our own fantasy, right? As parents, we all do about who our child will be, how they'll treat us at any age, what parenting will be like. And if we're not aware of our own internal process, unknowingly, we might project that disappointment onto our kid when they haven't done anything wrong but be themselves. And it's just that themselves is not who we imagine they might be.
Yeah. And there's grief in that for a parent too, to
For
let go of
sure.
these
Yeah.
expectations. Yeah.
I liked about the change triangle how you mention in the book, I think I wrote it down, that you shouldn't teach your children the change triangle, but should model the behavior instead. And I feel like that was kind of jumped out at me because it might be so easy to just be like, here's the task and like, look at me doing it without actually showing the piece. So I think it speaks really well to what you're saying there about like disgust and disappointment and how you sort of show up as a parent in those ways.
For sure. And like that kids learn a lot more by seeing what we do versus what we say, you know? And so you can impart the language of the change triangle just through your actions. Now, I will say when you have a kid that is a teenager, like my child is almost 18 years old. So in writing the book, she's heard me talk a lot about the change triangle. And I would say, like, when your kid's older, you probably definitely could show it to them. And if it resonates, again, we don't want to shove anything down a child's throat, especially a teenager, that'll make them kind of go the other direction. But if it's resonating, I think definitely when a kid is mid-teenager on up, they could definitely see the change triangle if they're curious about it, start to use it in their own lives.
We touched on this just briefly. We talked about how parenting activates old wounds. What does it mean to be emotionally honest versus emotionally unfiltered?
That's such a great question. And I feel like emotional honesty comes from our own place of self-reflection and grounded vulnerability. And emotionally unfiltered comes from a place sometimes where we don't even realize it, but we're not emotionally regulated and we're reactive. So everything kind of just comes pouring out, when we're
Hmm.
just kind of left, as we might also say in therapy, our own window of tolerance. And everything just is coming out versus emotionally honest. I've reflected on it. I'm being appropriately vulnerable. And I want to kind of share this because there's meaning in it where I want to convey a message. Anger, right? If we're angry with our kid, anger is a hard emotion, I think, for all of us. But if I reflect on my anger and I know how I want to share it with my child and be honest about it, that's very different than, and we've all been there, losing our shit on our kids. I also want to say that we all do these things. We're all emotionally honest and emotionally unfiltered
Hmm.
and that there's no shame in any of that for parents. It's just helping us build our awareness so we have more freedom in making a choice.
I really like how this book is punctuated with guiding lights for dealing with the different emotions. And we've mentioned them already, but it's the four capacities of the open-hearted state. So can you maybe expand a little bit more on these? The calm, connection, curiosity, compassion?
Yeah, so the four capacities of the open-hearted state, these are all things that we're able to do when we're in that more authentic place within ourselves. And that's kind of where we want to aim to get to, especially if we're at that top of the triangle and we're not going to go from an inhibitory emotion to the open-hearted state. We have to get to our core emotions. But for example, like calm, you can use your body as a guide. Like I always tell my clients, your body does not lie. So if we just learn to be really in tune and in touch with our body, we'll know when we're not feeling calm. And we'll have a signal, a physical signal that can point us to what type of emotion we're experiencing. And so let's say I'm really anxious, I might have like butterflies in my stomach. I might feel tension in my shoulders. But if I recognize that physical symptom right away, I can take a beat and do something super simple that helps me to feel calmer and a easy breathing exercise that we talk about in the book and that I teach almost all the parents I work with to do because it's such a useful tool is simply to take like a really deep breath and then on the exhale to exhale really slowly through pursed lips like you're blowing on hot soup. And to do that, a number of times, what that does is it gives the vagus nerve in the body like a tight squeeze, and it helps to calm down the nervous system. There are a lot of other tools we talk about in the book, grounding exercises, kind of tenets in kind of mindfulness that can help with calm. And then there's connection. And that means not just a connection with our child, which we want to have, but it's a connection with ourself. So that might even be a moment of self-reflection that can help us bring some insight into kind of what's going on for us. Curiosity. So oftentimes when we're in a place of dysregulation or our child's in a place of dysregulation, we might find our mind spinning out and we've all been there. We're like, why is this happening? Why are they doing this right now? Why is the day turning out this way? And we can go down like kind of that why rabbit hole. But oftentimes we don't know why. And so when we ask repeatedly a question that can't be answered, that can equal more dysregulation and kind of more frustration. And so curiosity is kind of a way to reframe those questions that we ask ourselves, or even the way we might ask them to our child. And a really simple way to do that is to replace the why question with a what question. So instead of why is this happening? What's going on for me that I'm feeling this way right now? What might be going on for my child that they're behaving this way right now? It opens the mind up to a sense of wonder. And really, with curiosity, we might also get into what we call in empathy research cognitive empathy, or what we also call in psychology research mentalization, which means to help us get into the mind of an other, because we never know what somebody else is thinking about. And when we stay in that kind of why place, or maybe where our mind isn't as open, we're not even thinking about the other person. Asking that what question can also bring a sense of wonder and help us. I know what's going on for me today. I have no idea what's going on for my kid. And so it helps us kind of get to that place and helps us really feel maybe unstuck, I would say. And then compassion, of course, is something that we know can be so beneficial, right? There's a lot of research on compassion, and yet it can be something that's so hard for parents to have, especially towards themselves. And even when they want to do and need to do something like just self-care, guilt. I'm letting my child down if I don't attend their ball game because I really need to, have a half hour because it's a busy week and I need to exercise because I need a half hour for myself, guilt, no compassion. So being able to extend kindness to ourselves the same way we might extend that kindness, right, to a family member or a friend.
I like that in the book, there's the guidepost to get to this open-hearted state. And it's really freeing to sort of name that it's unrealistic to expect anyone to just like exist in this place all of the time. In the book, it's like children don't need perfect parents, but they need parents who can repair, which I think is so important to just state, right? Especially if a parent's feeling overwhelmed. Can you talk about why repair is so powerful? And also what it teaches children about relationships.
Repair is so powerful because it models responsibility taking and also taking ownership over times when we say or do something hurtful and making a step then to make amends with our kids. And it's so important also to do repair in a reparative way because by no fault of our own, oftentimes we might think we're doing a repair when we're not necessarily repairing in a reparative way. For example, if I snap at my kid, and yell at them, and then I say, yeah, I'm really sorry snapped at you, but I asked you twice to stop screaming at the top of your lungs and jumping on the furniture and you didn't do it, right? Sure, there's been an apology there, but in the repair has not been directed towards the parent in kind of their own process. It's then pointing out what the child did wrong, quote unquote wrong. Something more reparative would be, I'm really sorry that I lost my cool and that I said something really hurtful. I can see how much that really hurt your feelings or angered you, whatever emotion our child expressed. And then you also don't want to force a conversation. You might say something like, is it something you'd like to talk about? Sometimes kids don't want to talk about it right away. And you can also say, if you want to talk about it some more, I'm right here, or we can revisit it later. So the other thing I want to add is I think also in this kind of like intensive parenting, we're like gentle parenting in capital letters, talking about our kids' emotions kind of all the time is in the spotlight. One thing we also don't want to do when we have a repair is we don't want to be quote unquote like intrusive. Like, why don't you want to talk about it right now? Are you still upset with me? Do you want to sit down and tell me? I really want to know how you're feeling. That can feel like really suffocating for a child because their nervous system isn't as developed as an adult's. So we want to own our own part. We want to let our child know we're there for them. We want to apologize for any hurt that we've, inflicted, and then we kind of want to let it be and back away. And I think it's important for kids to see this because one, a repair also repairs a relationship. So it can help to cultivate really secure attachment. And it also models to them how to take responsibility for themselves and their own kind of, no one's a perfect human.
Yeah, I'm sure there's nothing worse as a parent than maybe like losing your cool and then hearing your child like lose their cool using the same language or something,
Right.
like
Yeah,
you made me
totally.
do this. Oh, okay.
Right, exactly. Or toddlers, right, are so they're like such little parrots, like, I've had enough of you today.
Right.
You're like, you sleep 20 hours a day. What are you talking
Yeah,
about?
exactly. I'm going to teach you a lesson, like.
You've given us such great advice throughout this, especially with the four capacities for the open-hearted state. I think there's a lot of actionable takeaways there. But if there's a parent listening who is feeling completely emotionally overwhelmed, do you have any advice for them?
I would say, I mean, look, one, you haven't done anything wrong. Two, you are not alone. And three, even when we can't change the circumstances in our lives, we can always learn tools to work with our emotions. And that in and of itself can be a game changer. We might not be able to change a big stressor in our lives, caring for a family member who's ill, navigating financial stress or a job loss. But if we learn how to, for lack of a better word, regulate our own emotions and identify, name, and work through them, that in itself can be a game changer and it's so empowering.
I'm going to jump on to the second book. So this is the book of your choosing, and you picked The Witch's Daughter by Orenda Fink. Why did you pick this book?
I picked this book because I think it is such a beautifully written and so vulnerable memoir, and it is about the author Orenda Fink's experience growing up with a very narcissistic parent who also had borderline personality disorder. But Orenda herself did not even realize this until well into her adulthood. And just to read this beautiful, really raw story, I think is so healing. I think not just for Orinda herself, which I know in writing the book, but also I think it can be such a public service announcement in a way for people who have also gone through those experiences and feel a range of different things. Like when we're talking about the change triangle, anxious, shame and guilt, but have no idea why. So
How did this book come onto your radar?
I know Orinda through like a mutual friend.
Ah,
And like right around the time that the book was coming out, somebody had told me about it. And so I checked it out. Orinda also talks a lot about Jungian work in the book and kind of her own path in becoming more informed about Jungian practice and kind of what we might call depth psychology. So the power of our dreams to reveal something about ourselves that we're not aware of in our conscious waking lives. And I also loved that piece of the book and hearing about how that's also been part of her own healing and actually how even it was through her dream that she started to even realize and tap into the wounds, the deep wounds of her childhood.
so this is a memoir, and you've touched on a little bit of the subjects, but I guess could you give our listeners a little bit of an overview of the book itself?
So yeah, The Witch's Daughter is a memoir, and it's about the author Orinda Fink's experience in childhood, growing up with a narcissistic and borderline mother. And she gives a lot of really poignant examples. She grew up in the South. She also, in her first career, leaves home as a teenager to pursue her passion as a musician and talks about that and also talks about what it meant to separate from her parents. She talks about her relationship with her sister and then also how she came to realize that she had this deep trauma in her childhood that she doesn't even come to realize until really it comes to her through a dream. And it's after her dog dies, well into her adult life. And that leads to this opening, and it leads also to her deep interest in Jungian psychology and actually using depth psychology to heal childhood wounds. And now a lot of her work is also in helping people to identify when they've been affected or wounded by a narcissistic parent. And I don't use that word to label anyone. I also think that her book is very compatible with a lot of the work and Parents Have Feelings Too, which Arinda and I have also talked about, and how she's even started using the change triangle in some of her coaching work
Oh,
in,
Mm.
cool.
as a tool for Jungian work. So
That's cool. That's cool that you're able to connect the two together. This book really explores like the mother-daughter relationship in a
yes, the
very
deep
layered,
wounds. Yeah.
very emotional way. Just curious what stood out to you about those dynamics between Arinda and her mother.
I mean, just how hard it is really, even when you experience something over and over that is so hurtful, where you're not feeling safe, where you're walking on eggshells, where somebody, because of their own maybe unhealed, I mean, where do narcissism and borderline personality, when we put those clinical terms onto them, stem from? It's from somebody's own deep trauma. So you really see this intergenerational transmission of trauma. So for that parent, seeing how their own unawareness does not leave room for the other person's existence, separateness, mind, or emotions, and what happens when, all of us need to develop our own sense of self, but when that is really unsafe, how that plays out. And I think that's something she depicts like very well. And just how complicated, I guess, it is also to decide as an adult then what type of relationship is safe for you to have with a parent. And I know there's a lot of talk right now about estrangement, so I don't want to
Mhm.
say that it's always right to estrange from a parent. It's not, but in your own kind of work and working again with your own emotions, what is the right action that you need to take for yourself in order to feel safe and to feel connected, mostly also with yourself, and to feel compassion for yourself?
Yeah, there's something about when you're in a situation like this or any abuse, or especially as a child, how normalized it becomes. And my heart breaks definitely for Orenda in that the time in which she was growing up, there wasn't as many resources or information available. Whereas I know we talked a little bit about it now, where there's an oversaturation of content and information out there about multiple things. And oftentimes it's misused or not used correctly, or people are labeled unfairly. But yeah, it just makes me think about just her experience existing in a world before we had a lot of knowledge that was actually accessible. And I was really struck by her discovering the book about borderline personality disorder
Mhm.
and learning about it for the
Mhm.
first time. And yeah, I even have the chills thinking about how heartbreaking it is to exist in a dynamic that has been completely normalized. All the abuse was sort of normalized. And yeah, it's just so heartbreaking. And her mom, is a great example of someone who's like emotionally unfiltered, you know.
Absolutely. And it becomes so normalized. The mother is still needs to be, because of her own wound, in this very idealized position. So
Hmm.
there's no room for Orinda to develop her own self. And she then stumbles upon this book. I forget the name of the book, but I remember that it's by this woman, Christine Lawson, I believe. And I've read snippets of the book, but really that depicts different archetypes, I would say, of mothers, especially who are maybe diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And what that opens her up to, I think the other beautiful part in the book is how we can find ourselves through art. Orinda is a beautiful musician, and she started playing music at a really young age. Like, that's how I originally kind of knew of her, because one of my closest friends from high school was a musician and knew Orinda and her sister through the music scene,
Mm.
and was in a band with Christine, Orinda's sister. But for Orinda, what healing that was, to be able to have that portal of self-expression and to pour it into a song. You get on a stage, and I mean, I think, like, as somebody who loves music, playing music, or you're watching somebody play music, you have to be kind of in your most authentic self in that moment, at least in playing of the music, or of writing of the song. And so, how healing also creative outlets can be in helping us, when we don't even realize it, work through something that we don't even know we're working
Hmm.
through.
I mean, this is such an interesting thread because although, yeah, there's like the part of me that aches for her to not have had that label or that information, which felt so healing. I do think we tend to move towards like healing and wellness on our own without even realizing it. To your point, she had this connection to music and art that was really healing for her. So she was seeking out wellness, even if it wasn't like intellectually connected for her in the same way. So I think it's really cool to see that play out, someone like moving towards something that is creating a space for healing or moving forward, even if it's not directly connected intellectually for them yet. But it makes me curious about what you think is important for readers to sort of like understand more about having a parent that might have narcissistic tendencies or borderline personality or another personality disorder, and how this impacts their emotional capacity.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say in my practice, I work with quite a few, I would say, clients who have maybe a parent who seems to exhibit, I'm say seems because I'm not going to,
Right.
know somebody's parent, narcissistic or borderline traits. And I would say that oftentimes, kind of like Arinda, there's this world of confusion. I don't know why I feel this way. I must be wrong for feeling this way. I feel so guilty if I don't do exactly what my parent wants, leaning on maybe a trauma response like too much people pleasing in order to stay safe, but not having any language. And so I think that just having a language for what the experience is a great starting point. And then being able to look inside a little bit to identify kind of not even starting off the emotion. Somebody might know the emotions right away, but not know why they're experiencing them. Because I think so often in really deep childhood trauma, the narrative is jagged. And
Mhm.
so without a coherent narrative, it's very hard to even understand what happened. And if we can't understand, at least in the sense of a narrative, not deep understanding in the endpoint of healing, it's very hard to articulate it and to start on whatever that kind of healing journey, for lack of a better word, might look like for each person.
There's a strong thread of intergenerational trauma, inherited pain throughout the story. And to bring it back a little bit to your book, what's important for people to understand about inherited trauma and its impact like on our daily experience and emotions?
Mhm. I mean, inherited trauma at the most kind of intense is when we're really, if we go back to the change triangle, we're living at the top of the triangle. We don't even realize it. We have a lot of anxiety, guilt, and shame. We might not even realize it. And we're operating with our defenses because we're trying to avoid those painful feelings. But really, while those defenses serve, they're brilliant in the sense they serve a purpose to protect us from the pain, that they actually don't serve us very well in the long run because they don't help us to really truly survive and they don't help us thrive. And we don't have access then to the true sense of our being and who we really want to be or become.
Yeah, there's something about learning about the role that you play, I guess, within a family or parent dynamic as well. It was a really interesting read watching, or I guess as a reader, coming along with Orinda's journey and her sort of learning that she does have a little bit of more autonomy than she probably thought you were. It's like, you grow up and your family is the only thing you know. So that's
Right,
the
it's
source
your
of your truth.
reality. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
It becomes your reality. And so I think also recognizing that just because something was your reality in the past doesn't mean it has to be your reality now. But I think the other thing with intergenerational trauma is the past shows up in the present.
Mm.
The past is also the past, but the past shapes who we become and it shows up in the present in the sense it affects the way we feel and our perception of ourselves or of interactions we have with others.
I like there was a quote that I wrote down. You're talking about the past and the present. I think Orinda is like driving somewhere and says, "There's no rear mirror, but that was okay. I wouldn't have looked back anyway." Which I was just like, what a good line.
Yeah,
You're
that's
just like
such a great line.
leaving it
Yeah.
behind. The writing of this book was really, really great. And we talked a little bit about music and creativity being woven into the storytelling. And I personally really liked that the part breaks within the book had Orinda's songs because I listened to it as the audiobook, which was it's always such a pleasant surprise when you're just like, wait, why does this audiobook have music all of a sudden? Especially at the beginning because it doesn't go into I didn't know that Orinda was a
Right,
musician.
she was
So
a musician.
yeah, and you kind of put it all together as you're listening to the audiobook. But beyond that, it's sort of like it's a memoir, but it also blends in like magical realism, like a lot
Yes.
of emotional truth, and it's a different style of memoir. So I was just wondering, like, what did you think as a reader? What does that allow the author to express in a way that they perhaps couldn't have in a more traditional memoir?
I think it really allows, like my experience in the book, for the reader to really experience this really deep experience of the author. I mean, the writing is so beautiful. And Orinda is not somebody that took a ton of writing classes. And I mean, she worked on her book for a long time, but she became a writer of her memoir by reading and also because she's a songwriter. And so I think that you get this very different experience then through the book, through her writing style, because it's almost like reading a long poem in a way. It's so poetic. And I think for somebody that likes that style, that there's can be something in the way somebody else says something that can really spark something inside of us that makes us feel seen and understood ourselves. So we can find ourselves in somebody else's words. And I think that also can be very healing, especially for somebody that might have had an experience similar to Arinda's, can't put language on it, but finds themselves in her words that she says what they have experienced but cannot say.
Yeah, I love reading memoirs, and it's just like reading along with somebody's journey as they're sort of discovering these different aspects of themselves. I always find it so inspiring.
Now I want to listen to the audiobook.
Oh, oh.
I read it, so I'm like, oh, that's so interesting to hear. I didn't know that about the music. That's really beautiful. And to your point, Julie, the way she approached the writing might be so different. So she's bringing these aspects of herself just authentically into the
Right.
process, which is really cool to see because it feels like sometimes you're supposed to follow a certain format when it comes to writing or writing a memoir. So that's really cool to hear. Who would you recommend this book to?
I think a lot of people would benefit from this book. Therapists, I think, would really enjoy this book. Somebody who obviously has had similar experiences, or maybe you have a friend or somebody in your life who had experienced a lot of childhood trauma, what we might call like relational or emotional trauma, and you're wanting to understand a little bit more of their experience. But obviously, that's a vulnerable thing maybe to talk about if somebody doesn't want to talk about it. But I think even like reading the book is very informative. I think it's a great form of like bibliotherapy in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, putting words to maybe experiences you have in a way that doesn't feel directly your experience, and you can kind of pace yourself in how you read something. And I think with any book we talk about, it's important to go back to how you're feeling impacted and taking care of yourself if you need. But I think that's great about reading a memoir is you can kind of go at your own pace too.
Absolutely. Kind of like listening to a song.
So, anything else with this book before we wrap up? Thank you for bringing this one in. It was really unexpected. I hadn't heard of it before, so it was really interesting and very dynamic.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, I thought it was like a really unique book. That's why
Mm.
I chose it and fits well kind of within psychology and things that I talk about also in Parents Have Feelings Too. And it's just such a different style of writing than a lot of memoirs. So,
Awesome. So, if people are interested in either finding your book or connecting with you professionally, where can listeners find you online?
yes, you can find me online at my website, www.drjulifraga, Fraga.com. You can also find Hillary and I on Instagram, and it's at Parents Have Feelings Too. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. I don't know if people go to LinkedIn all that often, but I would say either my personal website or Instagram are great places to start off.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. It was so lovely to meet both of you and talk about the book and talk about Orinda's book. And I'm so grateful to have spent the morning with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or a mental health practitioner or an author interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
If you're in California and interested in working with Amanda, you can find her at amandathrockmorton.com and follow us on socials. We're at Books from Your Therapist on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and Substack. And if you're enjoying this podcast, let us know by leaving us a nice review.
Happy listening to and working through your own feelings.
Happy curiosity seeking. I think that's what stuck with me the most. Happy curiosity seeking.